All right, welcome back to Topics in Ancient World History. Today we're going to continue our examination of this key concept, Christianity based on the core beliefs and teachings of the divinity of Jesus of Nazareth, as recorded by his disciple, drew on Judaism and Roman and Hellenistic influences. And I'm going to stop it right there because that's where today's video basically is going to be about. So looking at the resurrection, or this core belief within Christianity, resurrection of the flesh or body, right, and or immortality of the soul. This is this is a good time to kind of jump between the core beliefs within Christianity and the influences specifically from Hellenism, right, Hellenistic influences. Okay, so that's what our topic today is. Once again, disclaimer, I am a lowly high school history teacher attempting to apply the curriculum framework or a curriculum framework. I am not a professor of history, philosophy, theology, etc. I'm not a theologian. Please consult your own personal parents, priests, reverends, deacons, ministers for matters and questions of faith within your own personal life. All right, so if we're talking about this idea of immortality of the soul, that is a kind of part of the accepted core beliefs of Christianity. Is this, where does this derive from? It is definitely part of many Christian traditions, and you can make an argument that it is in the Bible. The New Testament does discuss explicitly the resurrection of the flesh or the resurrection of the body. The concept of the immortality of the soul, you can go to the Bible, the New Testament, and pull out some textual support for it, but it is largely accepted that this concept of immortality of the soul comes from Plato, right, and the writings of Plato, right, and Christian philosophers who then merge, merge Platonic thought, Platonic belief, with Christianity. So Origen, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, right, during the scholasticism movement, during the High Middle Ages, all discussed the immortality of the soul, resulting, in it becoming an accepted Christian view, right? So if we're going to talk about the immortality of the soul as a concept, there's a couple of things we need to kind of look at first, right? So one is we're gonna look at some René Descartes, and he does a thought experiment. And what René Descartes does with this thought experiment is he first tries to get us to examine this concept of, does the soul exist as something that is separate from the human body? Are the human body and the soul a single thing, so that when the body dies, the soul dies, or are they two separate things? So what he does is he does a thought experiment, right? So this is sometimes referred to as these kinds of things are thought as Cartesian thought experiments. So the thought experiment basically goes like this. And when I do this stuff in class, I would turn the lights down, ask the kids to close your eyes and just think about what I'm about to say. So imagine you are laying in bed, all right, and you're going to bed, you're falling asleep. Some time goes by, and then all of a sudden you hear right, and that startles you, right? So, right, you sit up in bed, right? So imagine yourself like sitting yourself up, right? You twist over, you move your legs, you stand up from bed, and maybe you walk over to the window to have a look and to see if something maybe outside your window is what made that noise. Right, so you look out your window, you don't see anything. So then you go and turn back, and what you're looking at is your actual physical body laying in bed. All right. So if you can imagine that, right? If you can imagine that, that you could be looking at your body, right? Then that entire concept that you're able to imagine that. Supports this idea that the mind and the soul are two separate things, that you can separate the two of them together. For example, you can't imagine an ink pen, sitting on the desk, hearing a loud noise, and then getting up and looking at itself. The fact that you can even process that the mind can imagine that, opens the possibility, that this could be the case, right? So let's get back to, kind of ancient world history, right? Because really Descartes is not ancient world history. When you talk about Platonism, right? So philosophies that are considered to be derived from Plato, Neoplatonism would have been a movement around the Mediterranean, as early Christianity was getting established, and and of course in the early in the 3rd century, Neoplatonism, sometimes referred to as the one or the good. Neoplatonism is firmly established by the 3rd century AD, by Plotinus, right? So he's born in Egypt. If you're not familiar with this, brought up within a Platonic tradition, right? Reading, interpreting the works of the Greek thinker Plato. After he moves to Rome, Plotinus becomes an influential member of a group dedicated to Platonic scholarship. So the Neoplatonists, right, is a term that eventually gets coined in the 1800s. But this is, largely what it's referring to is the revival of this, right? So these thinkers, they will outline a pretty complex cosmology, which link human with the divine. So this will become very influential in early Christianity, within Judaism at the time, and eventually Muslim religious scholars, right? As Islam, gets underway. All right. So anyway, so let's kind of combine this idea of the soul, right, with this notion of of Christianity and immortality. All right. So if you can imagine that the soul is separate from the human body, this kind of brings up the idea of, is the soul or mortal, or is the soul something that maybe it is or maybe it is not separate from the human body, but it dies when the human body dies, right? And when you're talking about Neoplatonism, they will often go back to the the dialogues of people like Plato. For example, Phaedo, right, is it's probably the most commonly referenced. So a couple of things to make sure we kind of understand is, in Phaedo we have a discussion between Phaedo and a number of students and Socrates, and these were all put down by Plato, right? So not much of what Socrates actually wrote, or I don't even know if he wrote anything, right? Most of what we know from Socrates was written down by Plato. So we have this dialogue, and in this dialogue, it covers a number of different things. So I'm just really gonna kind of get into this idea of from Phaedo, about the immortality of the soul. But and of course this is written after the death of Socrates, and this discussion is going on around the time of the sentencing for death of Socrates. So if you're not familiar with this, Socrates was condemned to death by the city of Athens. Socrates was offered opportunities to leave, even encouraged by city leaders to leave. But we know Socrates welcomed death, and he believed that he will live eternally. He believed that his soul would go on to what is sometimes referred to as as the Platonic heaven, or the Platonic realm. Sometimes we refer to it as Plato's heaven, or the realm of the forms. Right. So in order to understand why he would think this, you need to kind of understand what the forms are. And there is this belief within Greek philosophy that there is a realm of forms that is out there. And it is from this realm where the eternal, the eternal exists. All right. So, like for example, think about justice and think about what it means to strive for a society with perfect justice. Think about our society today. We are in 2021. Can you identify a society, either, a society that has a justice system that is, more pure, more perfect than the United States? All right. So does such a society exist? You can think about that. You can make an argument about that. But if you are coming down on the side that the United States has the most just justice system that has ever existed in all of humanity, then where do we get the idea that it could become better, right? That it could be improved upon. Somebody looking at this from the perspective of the forms, would say that the concept of justice is something that exists in the Platonic realm. It does exist in the realm of the forms, and that justice as a concept itself is eternal, right? So it's something that the mind can think about, and become truly virtuous, as you kind of think of it, thus you are striving for something that there is no precedent for. All right, so it doesn't have to exist in the real world, for us to establish an intellectual standard. All right, so this idea that justice itself is eternal. So the Platonic forms, right? Our mind can grasp this idea that perfect forms exist, like the idea of the perfect circle, a chair, a table, etc. We must free ourselves from the physical distractions, so that our mind can focus on the forms. And Plato, and Socrates believed this is where scholars have the advantage. Scholars who dedicate themselves to intellectual thought can elevate themselves to the point where, upon their death, they would then be rejoined with the forms, whereas people, individuals who do not dedicate themselves to knowledge and higher learning, they would be bound to this world, and upon their death, their soul would not go to the forms. Right? So anyway, that's kind of an underlying necessity in order for you to understand where this thing goes next. All right. So that's the Platonic forms. All right. In a nutshell, which it's way more complicated than that. All right, so let's move on to this concept of the immortality of the soul. All right, so there is a Socratic discussion that goes on in Phaedo, right, and where Plato's metaphysical views are really explored. So, and it goes, and I'm going to really paraphrase this really bad. So here we go. So it starts like this: how do we know when the death of the body occurs, the soul does not get destroyed as well? Right? How do we know? Right? When the human body dies, the soul doesn't die as well. All right. So the way that this would be examined, right, within the dialogue, is the ideas of the form are not physical, and thus they are eternal. Right. The forms are not physical objects; they are eternal, as is the mind. Right. And we're using the idea that the mind and the soul are the same. Right. So that which grasps the idea of the forms is eternal. Right. Hence, because the mind and the soul, because the mind grasps the ideas of the form, it is itself eternal. Right. So, right, just like all other things that exist in the forms. Right. 2 + 1 = 3. This is eternal. This cannot be destroyed. Justice. Right. Irregardless of whatever has happened in here on earth, the notion of justice is eternal. It exists in the forms. Okay, so that's one way to start looking at this. So, is it true? Right. So let's kind of look at it from a different angle. Is it true that something that is eternal can only be grasped by something that is also eternal? Right. So, hence the soul and the mind. Right. So, this is the idea that the impure cannot attain the pure. Right. So this is something that would be that would be critiqued, right, within the dialogue itself. Right. So likes are known by likes. And to use a modern analogy of something like this, it takes one to know one. Right. It takes one to know one. There's inherent issues with this. Right, looking at this from today's perspective, me as an American, I cannot teach about the history of Mexico because I am not from Mexico. It takes one to know one. A forensic pathologist. How do you do that for a living? It takes one to know one. So, right. But that being said, if we give Socrates this particular claim, right, that the eternal non-physical can only be grasped by the eternal non-physical, all right, we can then proceed into the kind of further parts of the dialogue, right? So let's move on to the further parts of the dialogue. Do things come into being from being composed by previously existing parts? And sometimes this is referred to as the argument from recycling, right? So we are awake now, but previously we were in the realm of sleep. Our soul was in the realm of the forms, right? So hence why we come to Earth, we then have these ideals that exist, right? So, taking a modern analogy here, right? So a car is made up of separate parts that existed before the car was assembled. And the car will be stripped into its parts again once the life of the car has ended. All right. So, right, a critique of this, right, is that the atoms that make up one's body existed before and will exist after one's death. Right. That means every part of one's body will continue to exist, even if recycling takes place at the atomic level. Does that mean that the soul and mind will be part of that? Right. So, what does this mean to be reminded of something that resembles it? Right, but is not the thing that it resembles. Right, so this is sometimes referred to as the argument from recollection. Right, so let's just kind of take a moment of this. Right, kind of moment to look at this. So let's take this image. Right, so this is a child's drawing of an object. So have a look at that, and what do you think this is? Right, what do you think that is? All right, so after you've had a moment to look at that, someone looks at the drawing. Right, and and maybe it reminds you of a movie, right? Maybe it reminds you of the movie Moana, right? So even if the person in the picture doesn't really look like the character Moana, right? You might be able to see this. So this was actually drawn by my daughter, all right? So if you ask someone who never saw Moana, if they see the resemblance, right, they would have not seen it and will have no prior acquaintance with Moana, so they won't see Moana or won't think of Moana. They won't look at this and think, oh, that's the grandmother. Oh, that's the mountain. All right. So if you've never seen it, you wouldn't recollect it. All right. So so this is that argument that the soul existed, right, in the forms in that sleeping state, and then now we are here, and this is why we're able to recognize these things. This is why we can believe in this idea of perfect justice, right? Why we strive for something different, something more. All right. So the temporal sequence here, right? So you saw the movie Moana, right? You see a picture that looks like Moana. You're remembering things about Moana. Okay. So we all know things about the Platonic forms, but they don't exist in this world, right? So, you can do this for any example, right? I see someone who's pretty, but they're not perfectly pretty. Maybe they have a flaw. This gets me thinking about the Platonic forms, and seeing of this reminds us of the Platonic forms. So in order for recollection to occur, we must already be acquainted with the Platonic forms. Here in where did it happen? Since the Platonic forms, perfect justice, perfect beauty, perfect circles, right? They're not in this world. I must have been acquainted with the forms before this life. The soul, the mind must have existed before our birth in the Platonic realm. All right. A modern objection to this might be observing justice in this world. Maybe where we think about perfect justice and our minds are beginning to develop the Platonic forms for the first time in this world, right? So, but moving on. How do we know that the soul won't come apart? So if we believe that the soul exists separate from the body, is it actually eternal? So take a modern analogy, right? Let's go back to our car example. Just because the engine exists before the car was complete, and after the car used, it was discontinued, does that mean that it is eternal? maybe the soul is like a car engine. It might decay, right? So, right, why not? Right. So, what type of things can be destroyed? Paper can be destroyed. Chairs, houses, anything with parts can be taken apart. Anything that is composite, right, of parts can decay, fall apart, or be destroyed. What type of things cannot be destroyed? Right. So, the Platonic forms, right? They cannot be altered, right? So the number 3 can never be destroyed. Perfect circularity cannot be destroyed. So the Platonic forms are eternal because they are simple. They cannot be taken apart. It has no parts to take apart. So the forms are invisible, eternal, changeless, and simple. They cannot be destroyed. So we have multiple premises here. Premise 1, only composite things can be destroyed. Premise 2, only changing things are composite. Premise 3, invisible things do not change. Premise 4, invisible things cannot be destroyed. Premise 5, the soul and mind are invisible. Premise 6, the soul and mind cannot be destroyed. Hence, they are eternal. And Socrates concludes that, and I'll do a quote here, and so the soul is indestructible, or nearly so. Right? So, and the soul is indestructible, or nearly so. Right? So why does Socrates conclude with the qualifier or nearly so? The qualifier will eventually lead Simmias to point out that invisible things can be destroyed, and he uses harmony as an example. Right? So Socrates responds with a discussion criticizing the analogy and comparing the mind to harmony. Maybe what Socrates means, or could have said, is that things are invisible, cannot be destroyed. All right. Maybe he means invisible to our senses. Invisible doesn't just mean visible to our eyes, right? Cannot be observed or heard or felt or tasted or smelt. A modern critique, right, continuing this discussion, 2,000 plus years later, might ask about radio waves, right? Like the forms are invisible to all senses, right? But unlike the forms, they can be destroyed. So a modern response to this, the forms might also include things that cannot be detected. And, the debate could continue, right, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, it's a pretty good connection to the fundamental beliefs of Christianity and the influence of Hellenistic influences, specifically ancient Greece. All right, that is all for today. Sapriati.